Now that we have our rear grip, fighting butt, and butt cap glued on, it's time to move on to the reel seat and the foregrip. This is Rod Building 101. Before we start gluing our reel seat, we have our casting seat, which you can see here has a trigger on it. This is a size 16 reel seat that goes along with our 7-foot medium heavy casting rod blank. So we need to create an arbor system to make sure that the inner diameter of this reel seat matches the outer diameter of the rod blank. We are going to create 3 tape arbors onto this rod blank, and they will hold the reel seat centered and secure while the glue bonds the reel seat to the rod blank. So now we need to measure for the tape arbors to match the length of the reel seat. The way we do that, we take our reel seat and we lay it alongside our rod blank. Remember, this reel seat will fit over the tenon that is on our rear casting grip. Let's lay those down, and we will mark the leading edge of the casting reel seat. The reason that we mark the very leading edge is now we have a mark to fit 3 tape arbors inside of this space that will be underneath the casting reel seat. To begin arboring, I'm going to take the 1/2-inch masking tape and start just above the rear grip, about 1/4 inch. And I'm going to rotate the rod blank and apply the masking tape directly on top of itself. That is going to build up the tape arbor, which will then allow the reel seat to be perfectly centered on the rod blank. Now that we have our 3 tape arbors on our rod blank, we're going to dry fit the reel seat to make sure it's snug. Now, as you slide the reel seat down the rod blank, the reel seat should not be difficult to force over the top of the tape. It should easily slide onto the tape and over the tenon, but it should not fall off. You could easily remove it and put it back on, but as long as it doesn't slide off, that's perfect tension. So now we're ready to glue this reel seat. I'm going to slide the reel seat off, and keep in mind, earlier in the build, when we marked the spine, we still have our mark from our China marker out here. This mark is going to line up with the trigger on our casting reel seat. That's because the guides are going to be placed on the opposite side of this China mark, and it's going to line up with the reel seat. And as you wrap your guides, everything from your reel seat to your guides and tip top are going to be in perfect alignment. Now we're ready to glue our reel seat to our rod blank over the arbors that we've created. I am actually going to use a CRB rod stand as an extra hand. I already have my epoxy mixed up, and I wanted to share with you a quick tip. This is our casting reel seat. You'll notice that I have used the masking tape to cover the threads of the reel seat. As I slide the reel seat onto the rod blank, there is wet epoxy. I will then be sliding the foregrip in front of it. That can push epoxy into the threads of your reel seat. That is something you do not want to have happen. That can completely lock down the hood of your reel seat, and you're not going to be able to use it. So a little bit of tape sometimes goes a long way. Now, since I already have my epoxy mixed up, I'm going to take extra care when adding epoxy around each arbor. Remember, this is paste epoxy, so it stays where you put it. I'm actually going to apply it here, spin the rod, use my mixing stick, and move to the next one. You absolutely have to make sure that this epoxy is on the rod blank, okay? The epoxy is going to bond the reel seat to the rod blank. Now, You do not need this much epoxy sticking up above your arbors, okay? So the flat side of the mixing stick, just smooth it out. And then I add a little bit of the epoxy here to the other side of the arbor and smooth it back out. Take this, put it on, slide it over, smooth it back out. What this is going to allow you to do is to remove any bubbles in between the epoxy and your tape arbor. Okay? Now, we're going to take the reel seat. We are going to slide it down our rod blank. And as we have done before, when it gets to the epoxy, we're going to spin it. I leave this gap to add just a little bit more epoxy in that gap because the reel seat is actually going to touch and come over the top of this tenon. If you have put a little too much epoxy in here, it will push itself down, so you don't have to add a little more epoxy. I kind of went a little sparingly on it, so I'm going to come back in and add a little more epoxy. It's going to slide right over that tenon, and it's going to help kind of minimize the mess. You will end up squeezing out a little bit of epoxy. You always do. It means you have a nice fit. Now, you'll notice there's a little bit of epoxy out in front of this reel seat. Make sure you have it spun and locked in nice and tight before you come back and add a little more epoxy here. One other tip, if you noticed, my last arbor underneath this reel seat does not hang out over the front of this reel seat. That way, a little bit of glue can get inside of that pocket and it does not restrict the foregrip sliding down. Before I slide my foregrip down, I am going to check my spine mark and I am going to line up the spine and the trigger on the reel seat. This China mark has been here since I first spined the rod when I started building it. It's going to stay there throughout the entire process until I need to put guides on this rod. I constantly check to make sure that everything is lined up because once it's cured, it's cured. So I'm going to set the rod blank back down, add a little bit more epoxy in front of the reel seat, make sure the rod blank is coated, spread the epoxy a little bit longer than the length of the foregrip, and now we're going to add the foregrip. Remember, there is a proper orientation of the foregrip. The tapered part is in the front, the flat part is in the back. And now we are going to slide it down, and when we get to the epoxy, we are going to spin it as well. You can tell, nice fit. Lock everything, and I have moved that reel seat. So I'm going to check it again. You should be able to rotate that reel seat. Check it, rotate it. Perfectly in line with the spine. Then we're going to add our final winding check with just a small little dab of epoxy. Again, making sure the flat side of this winding check is facing the front of the foregrip, and we just push it down into place. Most of the time, it will act like a squeegee, so you really don't need that much epoxy. Probably had a little too much there, but now we're going to clean it off. Now that we're almost finally cleaned up, I want to show you when we remove this tape. We're actually going to just pull the flag, and you can watch the tape remove the edge of epoxy from the back side of the foregrip, and it will help ease some of the mess. I'm just going to take that masking tape and set it right here. See, we have no epoxy in our threads. There is a little epoxy there on the back side of that foregrip. That's going to happen. But we have our rubbing alcohol and a paper towel and a quick wipe takes care of that. That is much easier than having to take a Q-tip or to dig out epoxy from your reel seat threads. Now, one last check before I set this down to dry. We're going to check to make sure that the reel seat trigger is lined up with the spine. And I'm going to mention, if you are building a spinning rod and you have a spinning seat, you'll see here, this is a standard barrel seat with no trigger on it. When mounting your spinning reel seat, we recommend the uplocking position. This is when the threads face the butt section of the rod and your locking nut locks into the reel, moving upwards along the reel seat. You will align the side of the reel seat that is stamped where the reel stand locks into this reel seat. You will align this side with your spine mark. Because remember, when we deflected the blank and put it in an arc, we marked the inside of the curve. So if you mark the inside of the curve with a spinning rod, the guides are on the inside of the curve. If you have a casting rod, like the one we're building here, this rod bends with the guides on the outside of the curve. That's why with a casting rod, we align the spine with the underside of the trigger. And as I mentioned, with a spinning rod, we align it with this side of the reel seat that has the reel on it for spinning rod. Now that we have all of our handle components glued onto this blank and cleaned up, we're going to set the rod aside to cure. Then, next step is guide prep and spacing.